Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the ex-Evo and got harem with Wanda? Part 1. Huge shout out to Stone Shield for this story. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. It is said that if the will is strong enough, anything is possible. That said, can anyone do it, clear the mind and focus solely on one desire, one need? And desire it enough to actually will it into reality? Most of the time it is nearly impossible to do, as few people in the world have a will strong enough to do so. Naruto was one such person. And though it was only a thought, it was filled with so much sincerity and need it practically came into fruition on its own. His thought. I need to leave. Another dimension reality. The Sanctum Sanctorum, home to Dr. Stephen Strange, sorcerer supreme and practitioner of the occult arts. What few know is the Sanctum Sanctorum is a nexus, a converging point between all realities and dimensions. And it was at that very moment that Stephen Strange, from his study, felt a rippling through the realm. Something was coming, fast. But before he could even move, a gout of flame appeared before him, ending in a quiet thud sound. He could honestly say of all the things he'd expected, this wasn't one of them. The air had filled with the acrid stench of scorched flesh, as smoke rose from what Strange could make out to be a burned human body. With all he'd seen, it still took an effort to hold down the rising urge to vomit. As a former medical doctor, he could see that most of the skin and muscles were burnt off, leaving bones visible. What startled him the most were two things. First, to his surprise, this person was still alive, and second, was healing via demonic energy. But first things first. In a swirl of smoke, he and the near-dead figure were gone. Xavier sighed sadly as he thought of the young man he'd been counseling for the last month and a half. There had been progress, but it was slow goings. It had taken more than 3 weeks just to get a response from him, and even then he still wouldn't open up. Once he was reasonably sure the boy wasn't a danger to the others, he'd allowed him free rein to move around the campus. At first he'd been worried that the boy was like Wanda Maximoff, filled to the brim with power and, in his case mostly, unable to control it. His initial look into the boy's mind told him all he needed to know about him. He was a good person, though treated like a monster. It had astonished him when the resident sorcerer supreme appeared in his library, charred body in tow. And then after they had moved him to the still being built infirmary, Strange had talked with him about the boy's peculiar power, the same one that allowed him to heal nearly as fast as Wolverine. A demon, at least in part, biologically speaking. That was something else. But when they'd run his blood through the computer, the readout showed a variation of the mutant gene, unexpected, to say the least. His concern at the moment though was the boy's mental state. Delving into his recent memories had revealed everything that had happened to him, resulting in his burnt condition. But recently the boy had started to talk. It wasn't much, but it meant that he might be ready to trust again. It had been a busy week as they'd managed to recruit several students. There was Scott Summers, who was the first of the students, then Jean Grey when her telekinetic powers manifested. And soon, he hoped the latest addition, a young man named Kurt, would make his decision. Making his way across the spacious lawn to a nearby tree, his wheelchair came to a halt beneath its branches. A beautiful day, is it not? He asked the seemingly empty area around him. It is, answered a deep voice, the emotion sounding strained. Visible only to those who knew where to look, a person sat up in the branches. A barefoot blonde 16-year-old teen boy, clad in jeans and a t-shirt, sat on a branch, his back against the trunk. You know, there are other students in the school. I'm quite certain they'd be more than willing to make your acquaintance. The blonde said nothing, preferring to continue his private thoughts. Xavier nodded, I understand. In time I hope you'll change your mind. Rotating his chair, he left. He's almost ready. Though the biggest and most important step was also the most difficult. As he left, a haunting melody filled the air. The professor smiled to himself as he remembered giving the flute to the boy as a means of expressing himself without words. He had to admit, the young man had learned fast. And when he played, it was like he poured his soul into the music. At night while most of the school slept, one individual was awake. Naruto lay on the rooftop staring at the stars and crescent-shaped moon. In his mind though, he was contemplating his life, his past, the present and most importantly, the future. Mostly though, he was contemplating Xavier's offer. He reminded him of the Sandaime with his generous and kind nature. He was very optimistic, but a good man. Maybe he was right. Maybe now, in this new world, was the time to start over. Sighing, he let the wind lull him to sleep. Several days later he gathered his resolve. It was still relatively early, only the senior staff being awake. Walking stealthily down the halls he made his way to the professor's study, as he was most likely there by now. Stopping at the twin doors, he prepared to knock, only instead hearing the professor's voice. Come in, he heard through the closed doors. Opening one of the doors, he poked his head into the room. I really wish you wouldn't do that, Professor, he said wryly. Charles Xavier chuckled to himself. You do the same, Naruto, countered the bald man, smirking. Touché. Now what can I do for you on a fine morning like this, Naruto? Naruto blinked. You already know, don't you? He asked, exasperated. I didn't need to be psychic to guess. I take it you're ready to meet the other students then? Somewhat pensively, the blonde nodded. Xavier smiled. Good. The students should be getting up any time now. I'll introduce you during breakfast, he finished, giving the blonde several minutes to fidget while grabbing a book to look through. Everyone was digging into their respective breakfasts when the professor rolled into the room. Good morning, students, he spoke, nodding to Aurora. There were choruses of good morning, Professor, from the still small group of students, Scott and Jean. If all of you could give me your attention for a second, he requested. All three heads turned to him. Thank you. Now, there's someone I would like you all to meet. You can come in now. And heeding the professor's beckoning, a young man walked hesitantly into the room to stand next to him. Aurora recognized the young man, having seen him already when he first arrived. Scott, Jean, I would like to introduce Naruto Uzumaki. He is a new student here. It is a pleasure to meet you all, he responded to everyone after they went around introducing themselves. Taking a seat he quietly ate, listening to the ones called Scott and Jean tell him about Bayville High, the school he would be attending with them. I have informed the school that he would be transferring in. I was hoping the two of you would take him along with you to school today so that he may start classes there, Xavier added over a steaming cup of coffee. Sure, Professor, Scott answered, with an emphatic nod from Jean. Hey, there's a football game tonight. You should come with us, insisted Jean, Scott nodding in agreement between mouthfuls of eggs. He rode silently in the back of Scott's red convertible, listening to the two teens describe their teachers and classes. Most of the subjects he recognized, having a little experience in already. Specifically, chemistry, physics, and a few biology courses he knew of already. Such was standard for genin to learn in the academy as each was necessary in certain fields. There wasn't much point in teaching kids to kill their enemies if they couldn't find where all the important anatomical weaknesses were. He grit his teeth. That is, he was taught incorrectly. On purpose. He'd had to learn the correct way on his own and without anyone's help until Jiraiya had taken him under his wing and taught him. Still, most genin were well versed in mathematics, various sciences, and a few logic and ethics classes, to name a few. Not too long and they pulled up to a large 3-story brick building, the words Bayville High School in large letters over the front doors. Jean looked back at him. Are you alright? She asked, sensing the emotions radiating off him. Brow furrowed, in this place I feel ill at ease. Scott and Jean shared a glance, the male smirking. Don't worry about it. Everyone has that reaction. Trying to be serious, Jean poked him in the ribs for that little joke. Looking between the two, the blonde couldn't believe how oblivious the two were to each other and to themselves. It was very obvious they cared for one another, yet neither even really knew about their own feelings, let alone how the other felt. His frown deepened when he looked to the top of the steps outside the main doors. She was wearing a dark blue suit and skirt combination which only added to her authoritative appearance. Her hair, a deep auburn, was in a tight bun, accentuating the high cheekbones of her face. A stony visage, a scowl cut into it adding more power to her scathing glare. All in all, she looked very sharp just angular. The disapproving glare she was sending them as they walked toward her, nearing baleful, was strong enough that it put his old sensei, Haruka, to shame. Dragon lady he mumbled, mainly to himself, but Scott snickered anyway. Mr. Summers, Miss Gray, you two are officially late, her voice deep and heavy and cold enough to make a person worry about frostbite. Jean quickly stepped up. We're sorry Principal Darkholm. We're. It was my fault, Naruto spoke, moving from behind the men into the conversation. I'm new to Bayville and they were showing me around. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, a new transfer student. Professor Xavier sent my files. He asked, betting on a hunch. It was just good for him that his hunches usually paid off. Darkholm sent a withering scowl back at him for stepping into the crosshairs and being so nonchalant about it. Yes, he did. Her frosty gaze swept back over Scott and Jean. You two can go, but don't be late again, her tone quite terse. Giving brief goodbyes and promising to catch up with him later, they jogged down the hall to their respective classes. And as for you, Mr. Uzumaki, come with me to my office and I'll get you your class schedule. Thank you, he answered lightly, ignoring her haughty glare. They walked in silence all the way up to the second floor where her office was located. Opening a file cabinet and flipping through several papers, she retrieved a thin manila folder. From within, she pulled out a single paper. This is your schedule for the year, she said, holding forth the paper. He meant to take it, but her grip was iron firm. Looking up, he intercepted her curious glare. This one wasn't disapproving, annoyed, or angry, just curious as if trying to discern the answer to an unasked question. It was like she was looking for something, but he never faltered, only sending back an apathetic glare of his own to match hers. "Thank you, Principal Darkholm," he spoke quietly, yet with a tight resolve, and walked out of the room. Darkholm was confused. Hadn't he left behind his? Looking to her hand, she found it empty, the itinerary gone. How had he? Her eyes narrowed. "So, Charles, you have another one. I wonder. Who are you really, Mr. Uzumaki?" And for a brief moment, dark eyes shifted to a shining yellow, with cat-like her eyes. She would have to watch this one, like the others, until she knew what he was capable of. 124, 125, 126. This was it. Sighing, he steeled himself before raising his hand and rapping lightly on the door, his knocks echoing as a series of dull thuds. Opening it, he walked into his first class of the day. The other students looked at him curiously, mumbling between themselves. "Yes, young man?" asked an aged professor, peering at the young man through exceedingly thick lens glasses. "I'm sorry for being late. I'm the new transfer student," he said calmly, and handed the man his schedule, a small handwritten note from Darkholm written in the lower margins. The teacher scanned the paper briefly before handing it back to him with a nod of approval. "Very well. Please, take a desk." Naruto nodded. "Thank you," he murmured and headed for a free desk to the side of the room. Sitting in the rather uncomfortable chair, he listened fairly intently to the teacher as he began where he'd left off. Physics. Though it was a little boring as some of it was material he knew from his days as a Green Academy student. Throughout the morning he went from class to class, introducing himself to the teachers and listening to the lectures, only letting boredom consume him once. It was physical education read. They were all such lightweights. He had no doubts that any green genin could whip their butts. As a genin even Sakura hadn't been. He crashed that train of thought before it left the station. That was a person he never wanted to think about again. He did his level best to ignore the glances he was receiving from the cornucopia of teens. He would have been even more nervous had he actually understood what some of the looks meant. "He's gorgeous." A short-haired brunette whispered to her friend in the next seat over. Guys in general just ignored him, though one or two sent dark glares. Please, he'd faced death on a daily basis from the moment he was born, and that's just counting the people in his village. What could these children do to hurt him? And that's what they were. He hadn't been a child for the longest time. His survival had demanded he mature far faster than anyone else. Chances were the glaring guys were the boyfriends of the ogling girls. What made it really awkward though, was that he could hear it all. However, his understanding was a little limited, not having received such positive reactions before. Lunch was interesting. The students, or the herd as he began to see them, broke up into groups that seemed to have specific themes. Having an alright day. Lifting his head, he saw Jean approach, lunch tray in hand, before sitting across from him. "It's been interesting," he admitted after a moment. "Though I could swear someone's spying on me. I've got that feeling of being watched." Jean smiled to herself, laughing internally. He had no idea. Several of the girls' tables were gossiping up a storm about the new cute guy in the school. He was completely oblivious in an endearing way. "What?" he asked, brow quirked at her smirk. Forcing the grin from her face, with some difficulty, "Nothing," she answered quickly, the picture of innocence. The tray dropped next to Jean's. "Hey. How's lunch?" asked Scott. Naruto's face took on a look of fascinated confusion. "I'm not really sure. I'm not even sure what this stuff is," and gave the mound of mush a decent jab with his fork. "A moment ago, I looked at the gray stuff and I could swear it looked back." "Tuesday's mystery meat," Scott informed sagely. "Welcome to high school cuisine," he added wryly. Sitting at the top of the bleachers, Naruto listened as Scott explained the rules to him. Really, it seemed a little tame. Sure, there were some intricate strategies, but for the most part players relied on their brute strength. Sure, he was a brawler by nature, but there was always an underlying plan to everything he did. Overall, he wasn't too impressed with the sport, but it was interesting predicting the strategies either coach would use. Really though, Scott was watching Jean as she hovered around the sidelines taking photos for the school's yearbook. Receiving a nudge in the ribs, he looked away from the field. Following Scott's crimson lens gaze, he saw what had garnered his attention. "Looks like someone's making a late withdrawal," he said, standing up. "Want any help?" Naruto asked. "No, I should be able to handle it." 5 minutes later, an explosion from under the stands lit up the night. "Have you ever considered contacts?" Naruto asked conversationally. He was a little guarded, but he could still sense the tense atmosphere and wanted to alleviate it as always. They had ridden back to the institute in silence after the accident at the football game. The stiff glare from Scott in the rearview mirror told him not to push the subject. "You're taking this well," Jean spoke up thoughtfully as she turned to the rear seats to face him. For a now rare moment, Naruto smiled. It was small and wan, but there. He knew what she meant. The unanswered question. "I've actually been at the institute for a while now. I just preferred to be by myself." So well you may not have seen me, I have definitely seen you. Who do you think dropped the apple from the tree out back of the mansion? Something about the two just made him feel more relaxed. He couldn't sense any ill intent from them. They were innocents. Iridide blinked. I thought that was the wind, she muttered, surprised. So you can control plants? Asked Scott as he navigated the dark road. Yes and no, the blonde answered slyly. Why didn't you introduce yourself earlier? Asked Jean, voicing an obvious but still important question. Naruto grimaced, my egress and arrival to Bayville was less than pleasant. The professor has been counseling me and we finally felt I was ready to meet you. Both of the teens were curious about the details of his travel and why exactly it wasn't pleasant, but his far-off look gave Jean enough warning to prompt Scott via a jab in the ribs so as not to ask the question. Deciding to change subjects, so then what exactly can you do? Scott asked. Naruto actually snorted. This was the most animated they'd seen him all day long. How long have you got? He asked in a manner quite reminiscent of himself before he had been betrayed. Sharing would only be fair as I know all there is to about your gifts. After a moment of compassing himself, I can control the energy produced by my body and mold it to perform certain tasks, he answered, trying to dumb down chakra as much as possible. Like you, Scott, my body stores energy, but I can draw it out and do stuff with it. He wasn't quite sure how to introduce to them the concept of alternate Earths or that everyone in his world was capable of doing this. The limitation is that I have to learn how to do these things. I can't automatically do it. And it has taken years, in fact nearly a decade, to bring my control to the level it's at, which is still relatively low I might add. So your mutation is simply the production of this energy? Asked Scott, eyebrows showing over his sunglasses. Thank whatever gods existed that they didn't impair his night vision. He excelled in leadership skills, whereas Jean was the real brains of the pair. So while she seemed intrigued, he was struggling a bit with the idea. As well as the potential to utilize it, Naruto added. But remember, I say potential. Almost like muscle memory, Jean suggested. You learn by doing. Naruto's small smile grew wistful. Yeah, well, it has some side effects. As well. The two were silent, giving him their attention. Creating this energy increases my metabolism to a gargantuan scale. The more I use it, the more my body creates, and as a result I usually have to eat a lot. Scott was dazed, while Jean was listening raptly. Think of my body as a storage vessel. The more energy I use, the more is produced, increasing my reserve size. Being that it is produced by my body, my cells are saturated with it. As a result, my body is a little different. A pair of wary glances were sent his way, one via the rearview mirror. The energy has augmented my bodily functions, he amended for them. Jean's eyes widened in understanding. What? Scott asked, seeing the girl's reaction. Everything about me is enhanced, Scott. My strength, endurance, healing reflexes, balance senses. It can be quite unsettling at times. Wait, enhanced healing? Jean asked. Yes. Scott scoffed in amusement. Just like Logan. Jean nodded in agreement. The same Logan that the professor has mentioned to me? Naruto asked. Most likely, Jean answered. So what is this energy? That one actually stumped him a little. Most of what he knew had come from Jiraiya, who was more into practical learning than Iruka, who excelled in total information coverage. Think of it as a base energy. It has the potential to become other forms of energy, but in order to do so I have to learn how to do it. Can you, maybe, explain that another way for the less science-inclined? Asked Scott apologetically. What I have already learned. I can use the energy to create duplicates of myself, for one. Scott and Jean were both bug-eyed, the former swerving a little on the road. Should I wait to finish until we get back? You probably should, Scott agreed. One accident is more than enough for one night. Already, the familiar long drive of the side road to the institute was coming into sight. Besides, I think you should show us just to make us believe you. Professor? You wanted me to tell you when I plan to demonstrate? Naruto asked, poking his torso in through the doors. The handicapped man's eyes glinted with interest in the dim lighting as he looked up from the tome he was reading. He had wanted to see him use chakra, not just from his memories. He felt his familiar shyness creeping up in him. When he sought attention by being the fool it was easy, but this was him. He absently wondered how Iruka could stand in front of the class and lecture every day. This is the energy I spoke of, he informed them, drawing on a little of his chakra. A blue film began to form around him. The audience, complete with Aurora, watched with captivated stares as he explained the energy. And it is, essentially, my own life energy. If I ever use it all up, well, you know, no matter how unlikely or difficult it could be, he inferred, finishing off and let the energy dissipate. Fascinating, Professor Xavier murmured, examining the plasma-like substance wrapped around him. So what can you do with it? Asked Scott from the couch, leaning forward in slight anticipation. With creativity and training many applications are possible, he answered, remembering what Jiraiya used to tell him. Remember what I said in the car? He asked, facing Scott and Jean. The pair nodded. He concentrated for a second before a pair of duplicates appeared on either side of him with a faint pop of displaced air. These are solid duplicates created with my energy, he introduced. The professor gave them a curious glance. They are self-aware, if to a limited extent, he spoke a second later. Naruto nodded. Yes. An imprint of my mind is placed within each upon creation. So they can even think and act independently. Scott and Jean were both gawking, not having seen as much as either of the two adults in the room. And when they are destroyed, the two clones disappeared in twin small puffs of smoke. All that they know, all they have learned, is sent to me via some kind of link. Psychic? The professor theorized. Naruto shrugged before shifting uneasily on his feet. Maybe, with more practice. And you know what they know? Asked Scott, impressed. Dude, you would never have to go to school again. He got reproachful glares from Aurora and Jean, the latter agreeing, silently. Never mind, he said meekly, feeling the weight of their combined glares. He went into his explanation of using chakra to cling to objects, or repel them. Scott and Jean nearly had aneurysms when he told them he could walk on water, and that was after he climbed the wall in front of them and dangled from the ceiling. Then, about how, with practice, he could further enhance his body by actively pumping chakra throughout it. Finally, he reached a more sketchy area of explanation. Elemental control. Earlier, I said that my energy could be transformed into others. What I meant is that I can, to an extent, change it into elemental energies. That is, fire, wind, water, earth, he said in amendment, not wanting them to think he was talking about the 100+ elements of the sciences. When he got questioning, confused looks, he demonstrated by gently waving his hand. A little over 10 feet away, Jean's hair was violently whipped backwards. He received looks of awe from the two teens, and looks of appreciative understanding from Aurora and Xavier. I met a man, a few years ago, who helped me to control my powers. When he died, his teacher showed me how to sense and utilize the energies of the world around me. What? Huh? Asked Scott and Jean at the same time. Naruto smiled lightly. It reminded him of his first days at the academy when Iruka first started teaching them about chakra. Smile still present, if I meditate, I can draw in and use the energies of nature itself, he offered. It doesn't feel quite the same, but I guess that's to be expected. Scott ruffled his hair in a show of utter bafflement. Not that he didn't understand, but that was a lot to take in. That's man. He said with finality. It's strange, really, surmised the professor for him. Your ability is simple enough, but its effects are so widespread. His observations were mainly for the others as he had already thought of such ideas earlier on. You're telling me, retorted the sunglasses-wearing teen, throwing himself back against the couch. Is there anything you can't do? He asked the blonde. Naruto just gave him a pained smile. Many things, Scott, but it is never as simply as we want it to be. As you are well aware, nothing is without consequence. Everything has a price. What I can do took training and sacrifice, his voice growing sad. What do you mean? Sacrifice? Asked Jean, more careful about what he was saying than Scott had been. I'm going to go get something from my room, he said, sighing tiredly. Can you tell them, Professor? Your objectivity would help. Very well, the professor answered, watching the blonde slowly exit the room before sighing himself. You will have to forgive his secrecy, the boy has seen his fair share of the darker side of humanity. Switching moods entirely, now, Jean, Scott, what I am about to tell you may be a little difficult to hear, and even more so to understand, but please do not interrupt me until I am finished. With their looks of agreement, he continued to lay out the exceedingly complex story that was Naruto, starting with his world. The concept of alternate Earths was something straight out of sci-fi, but with a little effort, they conceded and agreed to the possibility. Well, Jean understood. Scott just nodded at the more advanced bits. Naruto is from a world where, from what I have seen of his memories, everyone has the potential of doing what he can. Wait, so is he a mutant or not? Asked Scott. From my beepises, he is, Scott, as are, quite possibly, the entirety of his world. Whoa, the teen woofed appreciatively. Indeed, agreed Xavier. That was quite similar to my own reaction when I first learned of it. So how did he get from his Earth to ours? Jean put forth, picking up on a key point of interest. Xavier gave her a quick nod before continuing. To explain that you need to understand Naruto himself, he added. In his world, there were powerful entities composed entirely of energy. In fact, the same energy that the people of his world, and he himself, use. The teens listened as what felt like a fairy tale or lost story of history unraveled before them. His people, to protect themselves from these creatures, found a way to put them inside others so that the power would be contained and, eventually, destroyed. Unfortunately, for the process to work, The newborn child must be used as the container, Naruto finished, walking back into the room, stopping beside the professor. Why a child? Jean asked, barely over a whisper. My energy chakra is carried along pathways throughout the body. As the body matures, the pathways cease growing and harden into a permanent form. While placing the demons, as we believed them to be, in adults would be fatal, the container dying and the creature released, a child's body would adapt more easily. The pathways would grow to accommodate the massive influx of energy and survive while containing the beast. Scott's jaw dropped, Jean's not too far behind. And that is just the beginning. There are consequences to being the container of such beings. Stigmas. Often, the child is trained to become a living weapon. Sometimes the energy is too much and the creature can influence the host. I knew another who had been driven to the brink of insanity by the beast within him, he added. The people either fear or hate the mus. My childhood was interesting and for the first decade I never knew why, either. So, I repeat, the price of power like mine is high and I can only hope that I have finished paying for it. He focused on the tense teens. I told you before that my body is enhanced by my energy, by my chakra. That isn't quite accurate. It is enhanced by the energy of the creature that once dwelled within me. He held forth the objects in his hand. One was a metal plate with a swirling leaf pattern etched into it and next were a handful of knives, one of which had 3 sharp blades. And finally, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the necklace that Tsunade had given him so long ago. The original string had been burned to a crisp, but the jewel had survived and he was able to restring it. These are all I have left from my world. The tri-prong kunai had been given to him by Jiraiya in his will, and though he couldn't use it like the Yondaime could, it was still precious to him. It saddened him, remembering the noble pervert and that the book he had treasured had been burnt to ashes. What do you mean once dwelled? Asked Aurora, bringing the conversation back to a worrying area. Where is the creature now? Its energy is where it always was, within me, but its consciousness, its soul, has left, he answered the white-haired woman as he pocketed the kunai and Hittite plate. As for how I got here, he said, looking to Jean, not really sure at all. The way Strange explained it, I willed myself to leave and a different energy within me reacted and brought me here. Something about conviction or whatever. It had been a very confusing conversation with the mystic. So, would you want to leave your home? Asked Scott. The professor tensed, as did Storm, but a glance from Naruto told them he was okay with answering that. Do you know what immolation means, Scott? By his face taking on a green pallor, it was obvious he did. I was trussed up and set on fire, both as a response to what I am and in celebration of a former friend of mine being announced village leader. In fact, it was by his order. Scott looked like he was about to lose his lunch, as did Jean. So, as you can guess, there was a fair amount of incentive to leave. What about your family? Asked Aurora, having never heard the entire story before. He grinned ruefully. Orphan. Though he knew the deeper secret behind his family, it wasn't something he felt like sharing. He didn't want any more pity than he could see in their eyes. Xavier knew, he had no doubts. The man had been in his head after all. Conversation was rather tense for the rest of the night. The professor had let them all go to bed without digging into the whole football game fiasco. He felt that they were drained enough after Naruto's talk and decided he would wait until the morning to talk with them about it. He was amazed though by Naruto's admission. His trust was not easy to come by, as he had seen, but he seemed to have found Jean and Scott to be so, and quickly too. He retired for the evening as well as he and Aurora had a special appointment very early the next morning. Middleton train station. Charles and Aurora waited on the platform as the early morning arrivals exited the cars and onto the platform. Scanning the crowd, they were looking for one person in particular, someone they had never met before. Is that him? Asked Aurora, motioning to the young man exiting the train with a duffel bag. That's not Kurt, the professor corrected lightly before turning towards the rear of the train, where a cloaked individual with twin bags was exiting and doing his best not to be noticed. That's Kurt. Far north, a man pulls his Harley off the winding mountain road before parking outside a small convenience store. Removing his helmet, he donned a battered cowboy hat and headed inside. Hardly had he made it through the door when a newspaper stand caught his attention. Specifically, the name Bayville mentioned in the margins of the front page article. Trouble brewing back home, he mused before grabbing one of the papers. You gonna buy that paper? Asked the store owner from behind the counter. That's why I'm holding it, bub, he answered gruffly and tossed the paper onto the counter. And a bottle of water, too. Cold. The owner turned to get the beverage while he himself perused the article. He wasn't liking what he was seeing. Warm weather we're having for this time o' year, the old man said as he offered the bottle and took back the bills. Ringing up the purchases, he heard the sound of something being sliced, but missed seeing it. All he saw was the spinning top portion of the glass bottle as it settled on the counter. A second later, the bottom half of the bottle was slapped back down on the counter, empty. Recycle that, wold ya? The burly man asked before turning and leaving, paper clenched in a tight grasp. On a distant peak, feral angry eyes watched the small figure leave before snarling. The following morning, Friday, saw the occupants of Xavier's up fairly early as everyone had their own plans for the day. Scott and Jean were both setting out with Naruto in tow. Respective backpacks slung over their shoulders, they walked past the common area. Catching a glimpse of the professor, "We're heading out, Professor," Scott called, only to be stopped. "Scott, Jean, Naruto, you three come in here for a minute," Xavier called to them, interrupting their progression toward the door. "What's up, Professor?" asked Scott, eager to get going. "Before you go, I'd like to introduce you to a new student." Pushing the cracked door to the small library open further, the three assembled. The room was dimly lit as always, and the professor was at the far wall. What caught their attention though was the slumped, cloak-wearing individual to his right. "This is Kurt Wagner. He arrived early this morning." Scott immediately took the initiative. "Hey Kurt. This is Jean, I'm Scott, and this is Naruto." The blonde gave a lazy wave. "Yo. How you doing?" The sunglasses-wearing young man continued, offering his hand. Kurt immediately shied away from the contact. Naruto spotted knee-jerk reaction almost on the spot. That kind of thing came from fear. The young man retreated to Xavier's side. "Kurt, you are among friends here," Xavier assured, Jean walking over to his side. Hesitantly, the cloaked young man pulled his hand from within the folds of his robe, taking Scott's hand and shaking it. "Hello," he greeted in passable English, but with a thick German accent. Scott tried to hide his surprise when a second later he noticed the limb was blue and furry. Noting the expression of shock, Kurt pulled his two-fingered hand back quickly into his robe. "Ahem," interrupted Xavier, hoping to clear the tension in the air. "I was just telling Kurt how I set up this institute for gifted youngsters. Youngsters whose gifts are not always an asset." "Right, Scott." The teen had hoped that the fiasco of the previous night might slide by, even if he knew better. About last night. It was difficult to forget. It was on all the news channels, the bald man reprimanded. "It was a bad situation, and there was an accident," he countered, scratching the back of his head in discomfort at the situation he was in. "Sorry." "I know," Xavier acknowledged, steepling his fingers. "Fortunately, no one was badly hurt and the true cause was not discovered, but you must be more careful," he urged. Scott's patience frayed a little. "Come on, Professor. I'm backing a bazooka behind each eyeball. What do you want from me?" "Control, Scott. That's what you're here to learn. That's why you're all here." He turned to Kurt. Scott's eyes emit a disruptive optic blast beam. Feeling a bit more courageous at all he was seeing and hearing, the new mutant reached up and pulled back his hood. Cool. Dark blue hair fell around his long pointy ears, and his slender face gave him an elf-like, maybe puckish, appearance. "How about you, Kurt?" asked Jean. "Got a special gift that brought you here?" The young man was gone in a small puff of smoke, reappearing all the way across the room in a similar cloud of smoke. "Maybe," he answered playfully. "Whoa," Scott and Jean murmured in mutual awe. "Sweet," Naruto thought, whistling appreciatively. Though he noted the smell of sulfur from the smoke, he filed it away for later. "I'll be helping Kurt get settled in. We can talk more tonight." That early morning found a young, rather toad-like individual meeting with the school principal. And when he left, he was significantly paler, fear in his eyes. Kurt looked around in poorly concealed awe. "Whoa. This bedroom is mine?" he asked, not quite believing. "Of course, Kurt," Xavier answered. Aurora walked to his side, a package in hand. "Your parents sent you to us because they knew that you would be happy here." Kurt's smile sagged a little. "Happy?" He turned to stare at his reflection in the mirror over the dresser. "How can I be happy when I look like this? I scare people." The weather witch placed the package on the bed for him to find later. Smiling, Xavier beckoned the young man forward. "I have a surprise for you, Kurt." Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a digital wristwatch. "Put this on," and handed it to the blue boy. The moment it slipped over his wrist, his image flickered, another taking its place. Kurt stared in wonder before shooting over to the mirror once again. His skin was pale, his hair black, and he was dressed in casual clothes. "I don't believe it." He looked himself over. "He looks so I'm normal." "Of course you're normal, Kurt," Aurora agreed from next to the professor. "But not because of that machine." Xavier nodded. "Storm is right, Kurt." Rolling over, he guided him to the mirror. "Normal is what you truly are. Never think otherwise. This is just a disguise," and with a press of a button, the hollow image faded, returning Kurt to his blue-robed self. "A disguise so that you'll not be persecuted by those who do not understand your gifts." Kurt nodded solemnly. "I understand, Professor. But nonetheless, you rule." He cheered, reasserting the hollow image. When they left to give him time and space to settle in, he noticed the box on his bed. Lifting the lid, his eyes lit up as he came to realize what was inside. The bell rang for lunch. Separating off from the crowd, Scott went to stow his books. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on your perspective, it was then, when the halls were relatively empty, that he was broadsided by Todd Talansky. Figuratively speaking. Cerebro came to life, jerking Xavier from his reading. Watering her garden with a miniature storm cloud, the senior staff member observed the blonde before her as he floated in the air in a meditative position, buffeted by the air around him. As spectacular as his results had been in utilizing his innate wind nature to fly, hovering was slowly becoming a troublingly difficult goal. His face was screwed up from the strain. He could levitate, but the control needed to do so was different than all-out flight. Remember, Naruto, your emotions directly affect your abilities. If you're agitated, it will only make the task harder. At the start, it had been difficult, but not overly so. As time progressed though, his irritation began to show as he shook in air. Storm. The only outward sign that she had been contacted by the psychic headmaster was a slight inclination of her head. Yes, Charles, she acknowledged across the link he had established. I was wondering if you might audition someone for me, and he filled her in with details regarding the supposedly unnoticed trespasser on the campus. While she was more than happy to do it, she still sighed in disappointment at the lost chance to further the young man's training. Naruto, I have to go take care of something, I want you to take a break for a few minutes. Once you've calmed down, try once more. He shakily dropped back to the ground. His feet touching the concrete floor of the terrace, wobbling, a bit dizzy from the intense concentration. When you've reached your limit, that'll be it for the evening. He nearly fell out of the air when the professor spammed the campus. The newest addition, Kurt, was in the danger room with an intruder. He didn't ask for the how or why. He may not have been in said room yet, but he knew enough about it. When left without command, the defenses were automatic. Anyone who didn't know this. Cutting all wind chakra, he dropped to the terrace floor and bolted back into the building. Oh, I get it. Nightcrawler exclaimed, understanding dawning on him, it's a training area. Having a bright notion, like this. Teleporting away from Jean's telekinetic safety net, he reappeared on top of one of the robotic arms. I just pull the plug and do off. The plug had hardly left the socket when the machine started bucking wildly beneath him. Whoa. Rah. A blur passed right over him. Fist rocking forward, Naruto tore through the section of wall, the robot arm exploding. Maintaining his momentum, Naruto landed heavily against the brushed steel. He was barely there before coiling his muscles and jumping. Watch yourself, he warned, shooting himself at the next target, a large spinning set of blades raised from the flow. An empowered dropkick left it in pieces. An arm tried to retaliate. Swinging down on him, it was blasted away by a red beam of energy. Gotcha covered. One moment they were fighting flaying metallic appendages and defenses, the next, everything went dead. Is everyone alright? Xavier asked over the intercom, tone stressed and full of worry. We're all okay, Professor, Scott called. Man, speak for yourself, Toad huffed. I'm outta here, and was out the door before anyone could stop him. Professor, I'll go after him. No, Scott. Let him go, Xavier countered. Still, Naruto. I'll see him out, Professor, the blonde answered, understanding. Blurring away, he shot after the slimy teen, acting as his shadow until he left the property. Kurt's head fell. I knew this would happen. I ruin everything, and in a puff of smoke he was gone as well. Go after him, Scott, the professor urged. Unlike Talansky, Kurt wanted to belong, but was more afraid of doing something wrong than the other teen was. It wasn't too hard to tail the fleeing teen. Even if he couldn't see him, smell alone made him easy enough to track. Then again, he was well within eyesight of him, so tracking wasn't necessary. What was really embarrassing was the teen's poor sense of direction. It took him 5 minutes just to make it up to the ground level. Was it really so hard to recognize an elevator door? Free at last, the Toad boy cheered in relief, popping out of the glass doors and back onto the familiar lawn. And right into the most imposing figure he'd seen since the principal had gone all monstery. Glaring apathetically down at the pale boy, he clenched his fists. From the spaces between the knuckles of his fingers, 3 blades burst forth on either hand. Toad cowered before the menacing man in his path. No, let him go, Logan. Both looked to see Xavier rolled out on the second-floor terrace. Giving the teen a final glare, he retracted his metal-coated claws and stepped to the side, gesturing lazily. Toad needed no further explanation. Place's psycho they heard before he left earshot. I heard there was trouble Brewin, Logan retorted. But then maybe it was just Stink Boy over there. Xavier just smiled at the man's humor. It's good to see you, old friend. We missed you. Despite his normally frosty nature, the Canadian former weapon cracked a wry grin. Glancing upward, why don't you come down, Naruto, the bald man insisted. Dropping silently from the branches overhead, the young blonde and Logan regarded one another. Logan, this is Naruto. Naruto, Logan. Logan grunted, the blonde responding with a nod. Nice to meet ya, kid. Likewise. As the week started back up, he almost thought that nothing else would happen. Things became interesting though when the professor took Jean with him on a morning trip to a neighboring county. A new mutant had emerged during the night. Kitty Pryde, able to become intangible. It had been the plan to offer her a place at the school. From what he'd garnered, she'd turned them down. At the same time, another mutant was detected. A far less good-natured one. Lance Avers, a student at the same school as Kitty. His was the ability to control tectonic movement in his immediate vicinity. In layman's, he could create localized earthquakes and tremors. After quite the harrowing tale of deception and finding oneself, the young woman moved into the institute within a few days, transferring to Bayville. Unfortunately, adjustment was not coming easy for her. And this last excursion, while it had cemented her with them all, it had aroused questions in the nebulous blonde. Knock, knock. Xavier peered up from his book. Leaning in the door was the more reclusive of his charges. Ah, Naruto. Come in, please, waving him to the armchair across from him. Is there something I can help you with? He asked once the young man was seated. Out of respect, he remained out of his mind, but he didn't need his psychic abilities to sense the conflict within the teen. Sitting in the chair, he was leant forward, elbows resting on his knees. I can't think that you didn't know, Professor. Pardon? The bald man asked, truly perplexed. When we were tracking Rogue, I caught a scent other than hers. Logan didn't say anything, but I could see he recognized it. Xavier was beginning to catch on. The thing is I recognized it, too. Looking up from the floor, who is Principal Darkholm? Xavier frowned. There wasn't much point left in maintaining appearances. It was easy to forget that this young man was far more intuitive and experienced than most several times his age. I would ask that you not tell any of the others, the professor began. I do not think they're ready to hear it. Naruto gave a frown of his own, but gave a small nod. Xavier sighed. The woman you know as Raven Darkholm is a mutant. A shapeshifter by the name of Mystique. She can change her physical appearance to that of anyone else. Realization dawned on the teen's features, accompanied by wide, wary eyes. She believes in a less than perfect future for mutants. As such, I believe she's been gathering a following of young mutants of her own. Polanski Avers Naruto interrupted. And now Rogue. Xavier nodded, face grim. The school is something of a neutral territory, Xavier added. As long as Mystique needs to maintain her cover, she cannot act towards any of you. The fog was clearing. I see, the blonde mused. The others won't like this. They'll find out eventually. Xavier nodded. Indeed, but I would rather they not have to worry about it just yet. Their lives are difficult enough already. I had rather hope to keep you in the dark as well and give you a sense of a normal teenage life. Chuckling, the blonde climbed to his feet. Normal is all a matter of perspective, Professor. Thank you. Turning to leave, he made it to the door, opening it before turning back to Xavier. I won't say anything, but you'll have to sooner or later. Indeed. Good night, Professor. Good night. He couldn't help but regard the principal differently. Whenever he looked at her, he would remember the professor's words. On the other hand, now that he had an idea of what to look for, he was noticing her moments of breaking character. Most often that was when she was really pissed. The air was a little brisk, but still warm enough that Logan took the students outside for their morning Tai Chi warm-up. Well, today it was Tai Chi. It varied from that to yoga, to calisthenics. Leg raised, arms overhead, he led them into a tree stance. Kitty was having the most trouble by far. That girl is not a tree, Logan growled to Aurora. I don't get why we have to do this. Kitty mumbled brusquely. It's to help with muscle control, coordination, and patience, Logan shot back stiffly. Frowning at not being able to stay upright, she sent an annoyed look towards the indefinable blonde. Then why isn't Naruto doing it? She asked him. Precise to her claims, the spiky-haired blonde was standing on his hands, eyes closed. Briefly looking over the kid, Logan snorted. Cause he knows what he's doing. None of y'all have had any training. The blonde, engrossed in his own thoughts, ignorant of an audience, shifted his weight until he retracted his right arm, supporting himself entirely with his left, his movement slow and methodical. Logan gave the gathered teens a playful smirk. Tell you what. Any of you can do that, can skip the morning warm-ups for the rest of the week. Temptation stirred, but after a second look at the blonde who'd started doing one-armed push-ups from his upside-down state, they decided against it. Not that it stopped the occasional grumblings. While the professor was understanding that he had nothing to his name in this world, he still felt a need to cover his own expenses, so started exploring avenues of earning some cash. As he wasn't averse to physical labor or getting dirty, that left some openings that most usually steered clear from. So, he picked up the occasional odd jobs, mainly from flyers or on the posted board in town. It wasn't too much. One week, he'd worked helping a local moving company. It didn't pay too much, but he didn't mind. Though he was more than once tempted to use clones when no one was looking. The other weekend, he'd spent all day Saturday and Sunday cleaning up someone's backyard, and it was a fair-sized backyard that had become overgrown over a long vacation. Feeling industrious, he even cleaned the gutters. Though, he regretted it when he stumbled upon a blue jay nest. The damn birds were vicious. It was at the end of the month that he had finally acquired enough that he was ready to call it seed money. Seeing as he was a minor, with no financial records or anything, it meant that he would require the help of his legal guardian. Well, as far as forged documents stated, that was Xavier. The professor had been a little dubious towards his plan at first, but after some decent explanation decided to grant the blonde a chance to dabble. I'm afraid I still don't understand this, Xavier sighed in defeat. Drinking his morning coffee, he was going over the latest stock market readings. For some odd reason, the boy had the keenest instincts when it came to money. Starting with only a few $100s, it had grown exponentially over the week. He was by no means wealthy, but it was still a sizable chunk of money for someone his age. Grinning at the printouts, yeah, well, the proof's all there. Sipping his orange juice, he stared at the glass. Majority of the time, I seemed to pick winners. Jiraiya used to say I had more of a knack for gambling than he winced. Xavier noted the twitch. Home was still a hard subject with the teen. More, it was that there was still a modicum of pain even in his few happy memories. I'll have set a bank account up for you by tomorrow, he interjected in hopes of jarring him away from painful memories. Naruto grinned weakly. Thanks, Professor. Any plans for this new cash flow? The blonde leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. At first, it was so I wouldn't need to keep relying on your goodwill, Professor, he admitted. I understand, but it is there to give. I know, and thanks. Sighing, the truth is half the time I'm bored out of my mind, Professor. Pardon? The blonde shared a wry glance with the bald man. I've got a lot of untapped energy, Professor. I used to sleep maybe 6 hours, now I can't do so for more than 4 or 5 a night, he explained. Back home, I had to be far more active than this. I mean, it's nice, but… I understand. You need something to occupy your time. He had noticed on more than one occasion that the blonde was the last to retire and the first to wake. His people were, using a motoring metaphor, high-performance machines compared to the rest of them, and from what he could tell the blonde was further amped up. Naruto nodded. Reading only goes so far, I need to do something. I was talking with Scott the other day, and he got me to thinking about rebuilding a car. He snorted in derision. I can get anywhere I want faster, but since I need that to stay under wraps, it could be useful. And time-consuming, Xavier noted. Naruto shrugged, smiling innocently. Silent for a moment, the telepath considered the options. I will allow it. The blonde gave a small nod of victory. However, the professor cautioned. Should your grades begin to slip, I will prohibit these extracurricular activities. An ultimatum, but a fair one. And one further proviso. Xavier gave a cunning smirk. Do you think you could recommend some stock advice? After spending a few days reading some maintenance manuals, he decided to get to work. At night, he scoured the junkyard when there weren't any prying eyes. And the next day, before school, he set up buying the trashed vehicle. Jean and Logan pulled into the garage late one evening after checking on a new mutant. Weekend and all, there wasn't too much to worry about being out too late. He'd heard about it, but had decided to stay behind. After all, today was the day his car was dropped off. He'd chosen completely at random, hoping solely for the most complicated one. It arrived just after lunch. The saving grace was that it was a Saturday. So he had the afternoon to identify the pile of scrap, which was fairly easy. The difficult part had been finding books in regards to taking it apart and rebuilding it. This was what he liked about working with his hands. Actually doing something. He was covered in grease and bits of rust, but he enjoyed every second. It was something he'd never done before. This was interesting. Engine unbolted from the frame, he lifted it free. It may have been too heavy for most, but it wasn't too difficult for him to handle. Not that he wanted to keep holding onto it. Stripping it down to the frame, he put anything too damaged for service in a trash pile. The frame would require some work. It had been left in disrepair until only the rust would have it, leading up to its stay in the junkyard. You look happy, Jean noted, exiting the X-van. He'd actually opened up more to the others in a little over a month since they'd met him. He was nowhere near his once boisterous self, but even he noted the healthier interactions were helping. And he doesn't, Naruto countered. Indeed, Logan looked surlier than usual. Setting the engine down, he wiped his hands on his jeans. What's this? She asked, but Wolverine beat him to an answer. Taking one glance at the beat-up hunk, Mustang. Late 60s 66, he mused, running a hand over the tarnished hood. Nodding, the blonde turned back to look over his work, arms crossed over his chest. Yeah, I'm hoping rebuilding it'll keep me busy for a while. Jean grinned. Better not admit to having too much free time or Kitty LL ask you for favors. It was true. The girl occasionally tried to pawn off chores on others. And she constantly hounded Scott for rides. I hear you, he conceded. Glancing once more to the one-day care again, hopefully, this'll keep me busy for a month or so. Think it'll take longer than that, kid, Logan countered. Naruto just smirked back. Believe what you want, he replied, words laden with amusement. I've already found some good parts at the junkyard. And he would need everyone to fix all the rust-eaten pieces. Shaking his head, Logan walked out of the garage. Good luck, kid. Out of sight, let's go, Red, he called. Jean jumped, remembering that she was supposed to report to Xavier with Logan. Oops, gotta go. She exclaimed, hurrying after. See you in the morning, she offered before leaving sight. Night, he called casually after. Now then turning back to his project, he went over all that he had time to do before he had to get to bed. Sure, he had the oddest luck, but most of all he was just awesome. Regardless of his relative lateness to bed and further to sleep, he still woke, fully refreshed, hours ahead of most everyone else. Xavier taught not only control over powers and teamwork, but also a certain level of self-reliance. So, besides training and schoolwork, they had chores. According to the list, today was his day for making breakfast. So he started pulling together makings. He'd barely thrown the sausages on when Logan walked in. Coffee's fresh, he offered. Get it while it's hot. Logan grunted, but took him up on it, pouring himself a mug of the dark aromatic liquid. Aside from himself, Logan was the next earliest riser. Offhand, he wondered if it was due to their healing factors. Not that that wasn't the only possibility. Paper? The X-Man asked. Already on it. Logan's brow crinkled in confusion as the blonde made no move to leave the oversized stove. A swinging door into the kitchen and small dining area opened, garnering the attention of both occupants. The morning mail pinned under one arm, a second blonde entered, open newspaper in hand. To his credit, Logan was only marginally surprised. Chuck had mentioned something like this, but he hadn't seen it until now. Actually sniffing the air, he realized that the one at the stove had a far more muted scent. At first, he had ignored it, thinking it was overpowered by the aroma of the coffee and other strong breakfast smells. Nice trick. Skill. And thank you, the teen answered, sitting at the island. Finished perusing the paper, he passed it off, sans the puzzle section. He may not be a genius, but, yes, he was that bored. Sausages are almost ready, the blonde manning the griddle section of the stove announced. The real one nodded before several more duplicates appeared at his side. No orders given, the copies walked over. One pulled a large plate from the cupboards for the sausages, while the other started cracking eggs into a bowl. It had to be enough to make pancakes to feed a near dozen people, so he didn't stop until most of the carton was emptied. Proportionally adding other ingredients, safe to say it was good that he was using a large mixing bowl. Satisfied that he had enough, the clone didn't bother looking for the whisk. Walking over to the original, it wordlessly offered the bowl. Dropping his pencil, he took it and, after a second of concentrating, the contents of the bowl started swirling, solids and liquids mixing. Logan noted this activity and the look of strain on the teen's face. Something the matter? He asked nonchalantly. Just a control exercise, the blonde gasped, stopping now that the contents were thoroughly mixed. When the clone relieved him of the bowl, he was left staring at his hand, flexing it. It still took a lot of effort to slow the Rasengan down without losing its form. Still, one-handed was a step up from his earlier years. Logan dismissed it, turning back to his paper. Just hurry up with the grub, will ya? Naruto let out a coughing laugh. Sure thing, old-timer. That smells delicious, Aurora murmured, stepping through the door far more gracefully than Logan had in his earlier shuffle. One of the clones asked. He'd noticed that she was more partial to it than coffee. Thank you, she responded, receiving the mug. This ass, Naruto mumbled, just low enough that no one who would reprimand him would be able to reprimand him. I heard that, the clone snapped. What's your point? He countered before ignoring the copy's sassing. You know, talking to yourself is a sign of insanity, the hairy man idly commented. Yeah, ain't it great? The teen retorted, snickering. Don't mind my clones, they tend to lean towards different aspects of my personality. Nodding to the beverage-bearing clone, I'll leave it to you to figure out what the apple polisher over there is based on. The clone had a few choice words for him on that subject in response to his ribbing. At one point, calling him a real frigid dude. Don't diss the master copy, clone boy, he lectured. A funny line from another author's fanfic. Despite the incredulous look, Aurora shook with restrained laughter at the antics of the blonde teen and his duplicate, hiding a wide smile behind her cup. And Logan actually smirked behind his paper. I see all the early risers are here, the professor offered, rolling through the already open door. Good morning. checking his watch, though I don't suppose the other children will be abed much longer. Yeah, kitty get up before 8 on a weekend. That was likely. Naruto had guessed that when she first moved into the institute. Looking to the clock, yeah, I'll lay off cooking the rest up till the others get up, Naruto offered from the table. Given that it was already 7, they shouldn't be much longer. It may have been a weekend, but they all had things to do. Noting the industrious clones, especially the one pouring him some coffee, the professor took it all in stride. This wasn't too unusual in this house, mansion. Don't strain yourself, Logan snickered. And afterwards, I want you to work on your flying control, Aurora broke in. Glider hovering? He asked warily. Aurora smiled with a tinge of wickedness. Hovering. Naruto groaned. Flight was just so much easier than hovering. 2 hours. 2 freaking hours. He supposed it was fitting. Control would always come back to bite him in the ass. Resting from the strain of concentrating for so long, he let himself be lulled by the familiar meditation taught to him by Fukasaku. The nature energy was different from back home. It was there, but so very weak. Not from absence, but in expression. It was like comparing broths. The thickness consistency wasn't quite right. It wasn't enough that he could activate Sage Mode to its fullest, but he could still gather a little. He couldn't use Toad Katas or increase his strength, but he could still enhance his senses. Pulling a sliver of the once wrathful chakra from deep within, he let it caress him. Xavier once again noted something peculiar. He'd seen the blonde meditate on more than occasion, but on the times he'd done so outside, he'd noticed some things. He'd brushed them off, thinking he had been seeing things, but now he was actually witnessing it. Since he had sat down and closed his eyes, the surrounding blades of grass started swaying in the wind. Except there was no wind. Even the nearest tree was acting similarly, as if aroused by his presence. This bore mentioning and further study. He had been working on his soon-to-be car when the professor rolled in, a question on his lips. An interesting one at that. Huh? He asked, sliding himself forward so that his head poked out from under the frame. Taking the path of patience, Xavier asked again, this time elaborating. Earlier, I noticed you meditating. MHM. Your actions seemed to prompt interesting reactions from the environment. Huh? The grass, the tree, Xavier tried to explain, realizing he wasn't too certain how to explain something like this. Are you aware of just how much your chakra, as you call it, affects plants? Okay, he understood enough of that. Well, yeah. I've told you all. Chakra is life energy. And when I pull on that other chakra it's even more potent. Have you ever tried cultivating abilities with plants? No. I mean, there were a few people back home who could do it. Very few. But for them it was a genetic ability. Me it's just, the plants like my energy, he finished with a shrug. Difficult for his position under the car. Still, I would like you to try and foster that connection. There is a chance you could turn that affinity into a potentially worthwhile talent. Sighing, he gave in. Sure, Professor. Once the wheelchair-using man left, he was back under the car. The axles were in disrepair, but were in surprisingly good shape, all things considered. Reaching out from under the car, he waited for a second before a wrench was dropped into his hand. Damn, but he loved mastery of the shadow clone. Tomorrow was Monday. His clones had already flagged some excellent parts at the junkyard. If everything worked out right, he'd have the superstructure done by the week's end. A few mysteries were cleared up as of Monday morning's classes. There was a new student. One that Darkholm showed fondness for. It didn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together. From what little he knew, this was the mutant that the professor had sent Logan and Jean to scout. Looks like Mystique got to him first. Least he knew why the short man was so pissed that night. Granted, Matthews was a royal prick, more so for insulting the oversized teen instead of helping, but, acting true to form, he jeered back. Tossing the relatively smaller teen away, Fred gave into his anger, ripping a series of lockers from the wall. When he ripped the lockers from the walls he had an idea of what his talent was. Don't you make fun of me. The teen bellowed, the lockers hoisted and slightly crushed in his arms and about to use them to hammer Duncan Matthews into the floor. He came onto the scene just as Jean ran over to him. Hi, you must be new here. The massive teen turned around to see who had spoken. I'm Jean Grey, she introduced politely. Naruto grinned. Jean was something else. Okay, she was off limits, but still she'd seen a problem and immediately gone for the diplomatic approach. Looking embarrassed at being caught flat-footed, oh yeah. I am. Duncan, taking advantage of this distraction, slipped away. I mean. Jean laughed good-naturedly. I figured. Welcome to Bayville. So, what do your friends call you? Dropping the lockers back where he'd ripped them from, in albeit less than prime condition, don't know, he answered back in confusion. Never had any. My name is Fred. Fred Dukes, he offered, shaking her vastly smaller hand. He winced as the lockers he'd mangled creaked. Well, Fred, I'd just like to apologize for Duncan. He can be a real idiot sometimes. Spotting the paper on the ground, she bent and retrieved it. Hey, did you need any help figuring this out? Well, yes, please. Okay, your first class is right over there, she answered, gesturing. Hun, thanks. Don't worry, the first day is always the roughest, she explained before walking off to her own class. It gets better. See you around. The itinerary crinkled in his large hand. It sure will, he mumbled in agreement, looking quite pleased with himself. I still don't understand what the big deal is. Scott blared gloomily, back at the blonde. You don't have drama class, he countered. If you did, you'd understand. And it has nothing to do with your partner. Kurt proposed, smirking, visage altered thanks to his watch gizmo. Who? Naruto asked innocently enough, pulling a book from his locker and closing it. Rogue. The blonde paused before nodding. I see your point. I've got to play a romantic scene with a girl who thinks we tried to kill her. Yeah, what do you say to something like that? He'd left a pair of clones to go over his chemistry notes while he joined in practice with the others. Jean hadn't gotten back yet and Scott was studying with Rogue for their drama class. So, anyone on the grounds was subject to go through Logan's and the professor's training regime. Today, it consisted of keep away, using powers. Honestly, the game was pretty chancy. Kitty could phase out. Kurt could teleport. And while he was for all intensive purposes more powerful, their abilities balked his own. Kurt could teleport forever out of his reach. Kitty just had to stay intangible. Kurt had the ball, but Kitty, phasing through him, scooped it up and ran. You gotta watch yourself, elf, Logan chided. She didn't get far though. Phasing through a tree, she was caught by surprise by a low-hanging branch and was knocked down. The ball fell from her hands and bounced right into Kurt's arms as he poured it into its path. It's mine now, Kitty, he teased. But how long can you keep it? Logan called. Indeed, the sky seemed to grow dark. Looking up, Nightcrawler's eyes widened at the blondes raining from the sky. Dogpile. They chorused, laughing. Ah. The fuzzy dude barely remembered to port away, and even then it was almost too late. Nuts, one of the clones pouted from under the clone mountain. Kurt reappeared a few yards up, on the branch of a tree. Watch where you're portin', the X-Man cautioned. True to his words, the branch snapped. Jumping, Kitty phased through him, grabbing the ball and yanking his tail on the way out, adding insult to injury. Haha, she giggled triumphantly at the seething boy. Logan groaned in embarrassment. What kind of move is that? And palmed his face. Xavier didn't look as disappointed though. Innovation. Adaptation. It's what they're here to learn, he reasoned. I also noticed the limb Kitty ran into. Brow quirked. What about it? Logan asked. I'm quite certain it wasn't there a minute ago. You asked me to dabble, Professor, Naruto confessed from the other side of Logan. So I picked up some stuff. We'll discuss it further, later. If it works, why question it? Logan glared at the blonde among them. He wasn't even going to try and argue that he was supposed to be getting the ball. Both tense though when the professor seized up in his wheelchair. A second later, Jean, she's been kidnapped. Logan started dishing out orders. You, elf, get Cyclops. I got a ride. She was at the school asked, Naruto called after him before turning to the professor. I'll head there and try to track her signature. Oh, Xavier agreed and the blonde disappeared in a blur of speed. But Scott and Rogue. Do you like me, Kate? Pardon moi? I cannot tell. What is like me? An angel is like you, Kate. And you are like an angel. Rogue let a small, amused smile cross her lips. The girl's rewrite. You are a charmer. A little embarrassed, look, I'm just reading the lines, okay. She brushed a lock of hair out of her eyes. Yeah, I know. It's just sometimes I wish. Yeah? Wish what? Wish I could get close to somebody, she explained weakly, before fire returned to her words. But you know what happens when I do. Bamf. Both teens jerked at the incoming teleportation, Kurt appearing on the tabletop before them in all his blue-furred uniform glory. Whoa, tender moment here. Sorry to interrupt. I swear. He's like an annoying little brother, Rogue huffed, earning a look of hurt bafflement from Kurt. His response was to stick his tongue out at her. Scott knew that for him to come for him was a sign of an emergency, but without his image inducer meant something big was going on. What's the problem? Jean's been nabbed. What? Scott's hand shot to grab Kurt by the shoulders, none too gently either. Wow. Easy on the exquisite costume, mind frowned. Wolverine's on the scent, so's Naruto, but I'm supposed to collect you, and finally managed to persuade the distraught teen to let go of him. RRGGH. He slammed his fists down onto the picnic table. He already had someone in mind. Blob if he's hurt her eye. He looked across to Rogue who seemed to do her best to not show she was even there. Do you know anything about this? He asked desperately, but still angry. No, she answered, but she was stung that he so easily thought she would be involved in something like this. But even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Then I hope you can live with your conscience, Scott shot coolly, managing to rein in his anger. Laying his hand on Kurt's shoulder, teleporter to maximum, Mr. Wagner. Catching his drift, Kurt saluted jauntily. Aye, Captain. Engage. Amph. And they were gone, leaving Rogue to stew on this turn of events. On words spoken. Words unspoken. Blame laid. Times like this she wished more than ever for the normal life she couldn't have. Logan pulled up to the school a few minutes after he had arrived. Like the blonde, the orange-clad X-Man had immediately been drawn to the wrecked bit of construction. Appearing next to him, they were both over there, the blonde supplied, reaffirming what was already guessed. Logan turned to him, listening. One was Jean, the other was the new kid, Fred Dukes. Know where it goes yet? Working on it. The blonde was different when on the job. He wasn't quite like he'd been lately, but he still wasn't verbose. Anything he said had a purpose. Also, there was the smell of blood. Logan tensed. Not much. It's little more than a scratch worth, but I'd guess it's Jean's. Her scent surrounds his leaving the area, but it's weakened, so I'm guessing she was carried, meaning she was unconscious. Logan grit his teeth behind the helmet. Good work. Back at the institute. I've been in mental contact with Jean, but she has no idea where she is, Xavier explained to his 3 present students. All I can tell is she and Blob are somewhere in this area, he elucidated, motioning to the highlighted area on the monitor. Then let's move, Scott barked, taking command. Within a minute, 2 vehicles left. Scott, in his sports car, and the professor and Kitty in the X-van. Leaping, he was up a side and on the roof in seconds. Judging by the faded scent of ozone and metal, this was a smelting place of some sort. Well, at one time anyway. It was abandoned apparently. He heard Logan pulling up down below. Once more, this went to prove that he didn't need a vehicle, but that was a topic of perusal for later. I found him. At the old iron works on the south end. I'm going in, Logan reported over his communicator as he loomed ever closer to the warehouse that was coming up. Logan, wait for backup, Xavier chirped. I'm already here, Naruto's voice whispered over the communicator. Where? Logan and Xavier asked. Roof, he answered simply. See anything? Peering in through the open section of rust-eaten roofing, Dukes has the place decked out. I can't see Jean, but I can smell her and I can sense her. She's in a back office. He went silent as Dukes came out, giving him a view of flickering lighting. Handles. Electricity worked. Oh, he almost slapped himself. The big guy had kidnapped Jean and made it into a date. That was just sad. In a pathetic way. Carrying the old record player with the greatest care, Fred looked absolutely bursting with pride at his clever thinking. He considered this to be quite the thoughtful move for a date. The door, slashed repeatedly, burst open, Wolverine barreling through, snarling. Immediately jumping on the teen behemoth, he started laying into him. Annoyed and bewildered by this, Fred threw the enraged attacker off him. Rawr. Wolverine snarled back before charging. Unfortunately, the record player had been sacrificed in the removal. It now lay in pieces not too far from the seemingly feral man. In a move of surprising swiftness for someone his size, Blob dodged the incoming attack. Grabbing the nearest heavy object, an old, rather heavy, turbine, he ripped it free of the floor and threw it at Wolverine. Snicked, snicked. But there was little the adamantium bearer could do against such mass. Hearing the ruckus, Jean struggled against her bonds. Confused at not finding the man behind the big piece of machinery he'd thrown at him, Blob looked around. Only looking up in time to catch sight of Wolverine as he landed on him. Grabbing his arms, he used his greater size to hold him off of him. Struggling, Jean focused her power, trying to bend the pipe wrapped around her. It bent just a little. It was just too thick. Not that her still-splitting headache didn't make it difficult. Having enough, Blob decided to try a wrestling move he'd seen on TV. Belly flopping, he pinned the X-Man beneath him. And breathe, Logan thought, gasping, unable to get any leverage against the teen's immovable bulk. She's my friend. You can't take her. The pipe was actually starting to break, but her already low energy was fading from the exertion. Need a hand? She looked up only to see Naruto drop from a removed tile in the ceiling. Naruto. You the hero, he chuckled. Well, Logan keeps Romeo busy, how about we get you out of here? A red beam shot over Blob's back. The warning shot. We're just here to give her a way out, Cyclops explained before his voice took on a dangerous edge. Through you, if necessary. Talking done, he leveled a blast at the teen. Blob seemed to struggle with it, but blocked the beam with his forearm, the red energy not seeming to bother him all that much. Smirking confidently, he started moving against the beam's power and back to his feet. Grabbing the unconscious Wolverine, he threw him at Cyclops. Not wanting to hurt the man, Cyclops ended his attack but was broadsided when Logan collided with him. They were thrown out the door and into Logan's bike. Groaning, Scott lost the battle for consciousness, his visor sent flying. Light steps approached before a pale hand gently ran over Scott's face. Marching heavily back towards the room where his date should be waiting, Dukes looked downright grumpy. Opening the door, he managed to do so only just before a file cabinet caught him full in the face. Resisting the telekinetic push behind the object, he raised it over him so he could openly glare at his date. Except, she wasn't restrained anymore. She was standing. And beside her wasn't he a kid from school. Like it mattered right now. "Nobody respects me," he declared. "And you're the worst. RRR, you pretended to be my friend." Not that Jean was too hurt by his outburst at this point. He threw the file cabinet back at her. Jean probably could have stopped or deflected it, but he could see she'd had a rough time of it. So he stepped in. Catching the cabinet in one hand, using chakra to hold onto it, he sent a warning glance back at Blob. "You don't want to go this road with me, Dukes." Furious, but no longer in the mood for a fight, Blob retreated, seething all the way. For 10 feet anyway. Then he grabbed a heavy machine and hefted it before turning back to the shabby office. A red energy beam splashing over his back made him drop the hunk of machine. Shoving it in the direction of the attack in retaliation, it shot past Rogue, her eyes glowing red. "Leave her alone, you yahoo. What you gonna do, Tommy? Make me wear bad makeup?" He countered scathingly. Rogue just smirked back. He made the mistake of underestimating her. "Didn't Mystique tell you what my power is?" she asked, walking toward him. "No. 'Cause I don't care." And he threw a punch, followed by others in attempts of pummeling her. He made a mistake though in letting her get so close. She grabbed his arm. He winced at the draining sensation. "My power is your power, and I can take more than one," she retorted before using her newfound strength to judo flip him into the rafters, followed by an optic blast which carried him farther and into a pile of machine parts and rubbish. Jean looked on in awe. "Not bad," Naruto mumbled in appreciation. But Dukes wasn't done yet. Bursting most of the way free, he looked almost maddened. "I got too much power, even for you. You can't hurt me. I'm the Blob." "Nah, you're just garbage that wanted a date. Now tell you what. I'm taking you out." "Good one," Naruto snickered. Blob jumped at Rogue, but she was ready. She caught him full on with an optic blast. At first, he seemed to float there before being launched back through the roof and away. The Hevasatine was sent near a mile away into the landfill. Everyone else had finally made it, even if they were too late to be of any assistance. "There you go," Rogue said, replacing Scott's visor. "I only took a short-term dose of your power. You should be back to normal soon." Regardless, Scott shook his head to clear the fog. "You're like an angel, Kate." Whether it was because he was delirious or a show of friendship, no one could tell. "My name's not Kate," she objected uneasily. "And I'm no angel." "But you helped us," Jean broke in. "Why?" "I don't know, I just don't know." Shoving past Nightcrawler, she ran. "Hey, wait." But Logan caught Jean's arm. "Easy, Red. Let her go." "But she ain't ready." "That's the tragic part of this business. You can try to save someone all you want," Naruto offered from the sides, watching the girl leave their sight. "In the end, whether or not they can be saved is up to them. All you can do is hope that the person you try to save lets you." "Dude, that was deep." Naruto grinned back at Nightcrawler. "But accurate nonetheless," the professor agreed. "Give her time, that's all we can do." The next few weeks were fairly uneventful. By their standards. At one point though, Aurora's nephew had come to join them at the institute somewhat willingly. Hey, it was better than a cell. "Like, where's this new guy?" Kitty asked. Today they were eating a more formal breakfast in the actual dining room instead of the kitchen. "Still sleeping," the professor answered. He had a rather difficult evening. To those that understood nuance, that one sentence spoke volumes. "Amph." Kurt poured it into land in his seat. Inhaling the wonderful breakfast smells, I love the smell of bacon in the morning. Last night still on his mind, Scott replaced his milk glass before turning to the professor. "I think he really knows who trashed those lockers. Did he tell you?" Xavier shook his head before tapping it. "No, and I'm not going to pry. He'll tell us when he's ready." Growling lightly, Logan scooped up some eggs. "You tell me, he's looking to settle that score personally. Pass the sausages, Red." "I'd agree with him on that one," Naruto added. "There's a lot to say about the power of a grudge." Spooning some oatmeal, he paused in taking a bite. "The bastard and I." "Naruto, language," Xavier chastised. "Sorry, Professor." "Habit." Still, it got to the point where we nearly killed one another a few times. The others, Kitty in particular, looked horrified. "What?" he asked, oblivious. "Some things run deep is all." Meanwhile, concentrating, Jean levitated the tray of cooked meat over to Logan. That stuff, like totally plugs your arteries you know, Kitty icked, eager to get away from the subject of grudge matches. Smirking at the girl and ignoring her, the man reached for the tray. Extending the claws on his left hand, he snared several sausages. I appreciate your concern. Looking back to Xavier, trust me on this, Chuck. I may not be able to read minds. But I know what a boy's thinking about when he's been wronged. Elf. Groaning, how many times I gotta tell ya, ask and it'll get past to ya. Hanging from the light fixture so he could get the pancakes, sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you. Porting back, he landed in his chair. That's better. Mind your manners. Things did eventually simmer down though. Evan was cleared after nailing the real culprit. The fact that they were rivals left Naruto in a bad mood for the better part of a week though. Whether the others noticed or not, he didn't know or care. It was his past. Not theirs. Well? Logan asked. Naruto just chuckled. Well, with some help from Scott. Logan coughed. I know, and you, what with the whole rebuilding the engine, the blonde placated, hands up. Those that were interested were gathered outside the garage where Naruto had been keeping his work in progress under lock and key for the last week. I must admit, Xavier mused. I'm interested in seeing how your project turned out. I live to exceed expectations, Professor. Pressing the remote, the door started lifting. Oh, and Logan. 27 days. The Claude X-Man grumbled incomprehensibly. Parked at an angle for presentation purposes, it gleamed against the light. That is so cool. Kitty cooed, her purposes for being there and hopefully bumming future rides. That is, she wanted to make sure if she did bum a ride that it would be one worth the effort. Awesome. Kurt and Evan chorused. Black almost to the point where light seemed to bend off of it, it had twin stripes of red painted on the top from nose to tail, all in classic rendition. Fully restored by hand, a 1966 Ford Mustang hardtop. Scott's eyes bugged a little. Wait, this is it? What did you use, a time machine or something? It was hard to see the car before them now, and the one that's been there weeks prior as the same one. What a wax job, how'd you do it? Winking, secret. Stepping away, he let the others have their chances to go over it. I must say I'm quite impressed, Xavier praised, rolling up beside him. This is outstanding work. Yeah, the blonde accepted, scratching his head. There's just one problem. And what is that? Now what? Xavier had trouble holding back a laugh at the teen. Maybe I could try my luck with another one, he mused. This time Xavier did laugh. Hey, kid, Logan called. Yeah. Come on. Time for some driver's ed. Okay, the evil laugh wasn't really necessary. On the upside, it only took him a week before Logan and Aurora agreed that he was good enough to ask for a license. The downside. He discovered the marvel that is insurance. Blood-sucking vultures. His nature manipulation, at least that's what he called it, was coming along nicely. Control was still an issue, but he could encourage growth in plants and trees. It had been a push, but he had grown a 50-something foot oak in less than 10 minutes for their viewing. Aurora and Xavier seemed interested, though Logan was harder to impress. It was still a little difficult controlling already existing plants. But then again, he assumed Yamato had had to practice at one point too. On the upside, not requiring hand signs but actual force of will, it was really cool. Poking at his lunch, Naruto was really starting to consider brown bagging. Shaking his head, he threw down his spork. Hey, dude, you gonna drink your milk? Evan asked from the end of the picnic table. Resting his head in his hands, he sent the teen a lazy glance. It's yours if you want it, he offered, nudging the carton along. Thanks, man. To his left was Jean, on the other side were Scott and Kurt, and on the ends were Kitty, directly to his right, and Evan on his left. The latter having a near dozen empty milk cartons in front of him as he continued to slug Naruto's milk. The blonde guessed, what with his bone-generating mutation, that he would need to maintain high levels of calcium in his system. It reminded him of Kimimaro. Not that he knew all that much about the deceased albino bone user. He wondered if it was the same with him. Go to Duncan Matthews' party. Scott immediately shot that plan down. Of course, Naruto doubted it was in any way related to the angry tensing of his jaw. Nah, I don't think so, he immediately negated, shaking his head. Done with his latest carton, are you gonna finish that moo juice? Evan asked. Ever the generous spirit, Jean handed him hers. You can have mine, she politely offered before turning back to Scott, the de facto decision maker. Come on, it might be fun, she pleaded, wanting him to lighten up. Scott cut the air with his hand. Matthews is a jerk. He looked to the others for backup. I have to go with Scott on this one, Naruto mumbled, shouldering his backpack. No, he's not, Kitty protested, ignorant to Evan stealing her milk. I'd go. Naruto looked her way, chin still in his hands. No freshmen allowed. Oh, Matthews is a jerk, she pouted, crossing her arms and sinking into herself. Half of the school will be there. Suppose somebody gets too close to Kurt. Scott proposed. That holo projector won't stop them from feeling his fur. Towards the end, Kurt turned an ire-filled glare on him, annoyed that now he was making this about him. But the anger was quick to change. Hey. Chicks dig the fuzzy dude. He countered jokingly. Right? He asked, leaning over to Kitty. Kitty rolled her eyes at his immaturity. I am, like, so out of here. Getting up, later. She called over her shoulder and leaving. Kurt grinned smugly. Oh, yeah. She can't resist. I'm trying to be serious here. Look, we go to Matthew's party. Suppose Dukes or Maximoff try to start something. Motioning to the so-named mutants across the quad. It was a good point to make, too. We're not the only mutants in the school. Yeah, just the cool ones, Evan broke in, sharing a high five with Kurt. Jean wasn't finished trying to get Scott to relax a little. Hey, come on Scott. What's wrong with a little socializing? The sunglasses-wearing teen flustered for a second under her doe eyes. But he recovered. I'm sorry, but I just don't think it's a good idea. By this point, Kurt could no longer stay silent. Dude, it's just a party. Jumping onto the tabletop, he started to dance. Time to shake that tail. Woohoo. Party. 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 Unfortunately, his tail waved free in the process. Right in Scott's face. Hey, watch the tail. He urged, yanking the younger teen back down off the table. Ignoring his outraged ranting, he looked around, hoping and praying that no one had seen. No one noticed, Naruto whispered across the table. Well, interesting as this sounds, I've got history in 5 minutes, and Latin afterwards. Groaning, he stood and backed up from the picnic table. Lucky me. Waving over his shoulder, see ya. 3 minutes later. I have got to work on my re-entries, the self-proclaimed fuzzy dude groaned painfully, pulling himself from among the destroyed boxes. Wincing, he lifted himself off the box corner that was digging into his back. Blind porting was not Kurt's favorite hobby, but he had been so angry at Scott. Why did that guy have to be so rigid? Seriously, he needed to loosen up a lot. Coughing at all the dust he'd stirred up, his ear alerted him to his holo projector, the watch-like device sparking on his wrist. The image inducer continued to spark, his image flickering between the projection and his real self several times before finally petering out. Oh, weak man. Who's there? Startled, he looked in the direction of the voice. He was in some kind of basement, the voice coming from a pair of twin doors, sunlight streaming through them and into the dark room. Fearful, considering he was exposed in his furry and uniformed glory, he looked around him. Opposite the way out, where the unknown voice was coming from, was another pair of doors that looked locked. Grime covered the slim windows, and a purple stay out sign with white lettering hung over the knobs. Perfect, considering his state of mind, he poured it into the adjacent, and hopefully safe, room. Again, he coughed at the dust in the air. Whatever this place was, it could sure use a cleaning. Or maybe a shovel considering how thick the dust under his feet was. Man, somebody should fire the custodian. Despite the darkness, he could make out machines and computer monitors. Curious, he stepped further into the room to get a better look, not noticing the red beam his feet cut through as he did so. Thus triggered, the screens came to life, halting him in his tracks. On them was a teen with tanned skin and dark hair in a light green shirt. January 22, 1978. Hi there. If you're hearing this message, you've got 10 seconds before this lab self-destructs. Have a nice day. What's left of it, grinning at his own final words before a countdown displayed on all the screens in big red numbers. Yoo-ho. You didn't need to draw Kurt a map. He knew where this was going. Dashing forward, he tried to find something, anything, on the keyboards that might be helpful. I knew I should have paid more attention in computer lab. No dice. He started pressing buttons at random. 3. 2. Hearing a noise and seeing a cloud of dust, Rogue had come to investigate. She was blown aside by an explosion from behind locked doors at the far end of the room. On the side of the explosive force, she was thrown off her feet, but the form that shot through after wasn't so lucky, colliding with the wall just next to the doors to the outside. Coughing from the smoke, she rushed over. Hey. Are you okay? She asked, stopping herself from jiggling his shoulder. She almost forgot what would happen if she did. Even though she was wearing gloves, she still feared what could happen. What happened? Groaning, Kurt's yellow-gray eyes cracked open. Lab. Booby-trapped. Rogue frowned. Lab. She looked back through the smoke-exuding doors, but saw nothing. Nothing but smoke. Walking over, she checked it out. There was nothing but smoke and wreckage. Well, whatever this stuff was, it's thrashed now. But that wasn't entirely true. Except for this. Towards the near corner of the room, fairly away from all the destroyed computer bits, an odd dome-shaped device sat on a tall, multi-shelf toolbox. It was one of those one thing is not like the rest kind of situations. Something about the gizmo attracted her attention. Picking it up, grasping the handle on either side, she measured it, trying to divine what it was. "Ah, what are you doing here?" Kurt asked, entering the previously forcefully vacated room, massaging his skull. "Look who's talking," she countered. "At least I didn't blow the place up." Almost immediately, he noticed the thingamajig in her hands. His mind flashed back to a countdown and then an explosion. Hey. Let go of that. There was no way he'd be responsible for 2 explosions in the same day. The pair grappled over the device in a desperate tug-of-war. "Back off, Blue boy," she warned. "Who says you're in charge here?" Kurt's attempt to wrest the machine from her grip failed spectacularly as she pulled herself free with the device in tow. A loud humming emanated from within the metal shell, and before either could react a red beam shot out and collided with Nightcrawler. "Ah!" he cried out before being swept away in a flash of power. The bright light faded, leaving Rogue alone holding the now sinister-seeming device. Her breath catching in her throat, she hurled it away, sending it skidding across the cement floor. Staggering forward, she clawed at the air, still shimmering, where Kurt had once stood just seconds prior. He's gone. Ah! Rematerializing, Kurt found himself back in the hallway in school. What happened? Where am I? The Twilight Zone. Spectral images, shadows of the real things, flittered in and out of focus in this shadow world. Despite their incorporeal nature, he dodged out of their paths. Then, a familiar set of ghostly people appeared walking along. "Man, Scott's gotta know when to lighten up," Evan whined. Kitty shook her head. "Yeah, but Kurt's gotta, know when to quit." "Evan. Kitty. Kitty. Kitty." He reached for her, but, as he'd seen already, his hand passed right through her. "No. Wait. No. What's happening to me?" Rogue, utilizing a caution brought on by fear, held the device aloft by a mop handle, not even wanting to risk touching it again for the consequences a second touch could bring. Reaching the dumpster, she hastily dropped it in, grateful to be rid of it. It bounced off the side, landing on the ground. She cringed, expecting to be vaporized just like the Blue X-Man. "Woo, what's this?" Looking back quickly, she noticed 1. That the device hadn't gone off, and 2. Toad was reaching for it. "Don't touch it," she cried out, fearful. Toad wasn't the sharpest, but her tone froze his hand in mid-reach. "Why not?" Its Rogue began before falling back into her usual brusque clip. "Never you mind. Just leave it alone." Not wanting to show just how freaked out she was, she reached for it. Delansky watched, befuddled. "What's the matter? Little Rogue get into some trouble?" Turning mocking toward the end. Rogue glared up at him from her kneeling position, taking up the device. "Trouble? No. There's just one less X-Man to push us around." And dropped the dome-shaped machine in the dumpster as she had previously intended. But that wasn't the best thing to say. If anything, it only made Toad all the more interested. "Say what? You mean, you toasted one of them goody goods with that thing?" "Wicked," he crooned, walking over to the dumpster to get a better look at it. "Hey. Just leave it alone. You got it, swamp breath." She snapped warningly before stomping off. "Geez, what is this, abuse the Toad day?" Delansky hissed to himself. Rogue out of sight, he focused on the doohickey in the dumpster. Picking it up, he looked it over, shaking it, and generally doing everything with exception of beating it with a rock before, fumbling with a button, it reacted. "Wow." He cried out in surprise, dropping it. Humming, it sent out a red beam and made the dumpster vanish. Halfway up a tree, he looked wide-eyed at the now vacant spot. Cool. Not too long into Kurt's little trip, the remaining others started to pick up his trail. He'd been getting a dressing down from Jean over his need to bend a little when it all started to unfold. After ghostly appearances and scant few other clues, Scott went for the first people on the list of those who had it out for them. But perfect timing that Dukes and Avers, key suspects, were headed their way down the hall. "What are you looking at, Summers?" the latter of the pair growled. "Where's Kurt?" "Yeah, like we'd tell you." Blob snorted, crossing his arms. Naruto, pack over his shoulder, came onto the scene to witness Scott pushing Lance roughly against the lockers. "I said, where is her?" "Get off of me." Lance snapped back. "What have you done with Kurt?" Dukes grabbed Scott by the collar of his sweatshirt. "Get lost, Slim." Lifting him off the floor. "Put him down." Jean warned. This went bad to worse faster than he thought possible. "Back off, Red, or I'll rock you." And at his beckoning, the hallway started to shake from his tremors. The assorted students started to gather, chanting. "Fight. Fight. 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 How about you all back off," Naruto intoned, utilizing some non-specific Kai. The last thing they needed was to expose themselves. Even he wasn't that stupid. The 4 teens hesitated at the pressure in the air. Most everyone felt a sudden aversion to being there, but only Scott and Jean had an inkling that the feeling was related to Naruto. "Fight. Fight. 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 What is going on here?" Darklem's voice cut through the din like a bullwhip. Almost immediately, the crowd dispersed. "We weren't doing nothing," Dukes claimed, despite the fact that in one hand he had Scott held aloft and the other was balled into a fist. Lance was right behind him, figuratively speaking. "Yeah. Summers here just went ballistic on us for no reason." Waving at the optically restrained teen. Dukes dropped Scott. "Oh, I've got a reason." Jean held him back by the arm. "Scott." "White." Darkholm snapped. "You three in my office now." Barring the fact that Dukes and Avers had been a part of the fight, she'd also seen fit to include Naruto, and he had done nothing. Well, relatively nothing. Lan sent them a loser sign in passing. Rogue watched it all, unnoticed, from the sidelines. After 5 minutes of mad porting he came to the conclusion that no amount of teleportation could get him out of wherever he was. Okay. Wherever this is, I can't teleport out. This is just way too freaky. He had almost no warning before he had to dodge a falling desk. Ah. It's raining furniture. In Darkholm's office, Toad, in uniform, was putting the gizmo through its paces, making the principal's furnishings vanish one by one. He cleared out though when he heard her dulcet voice approaching. Satisfied with his victory, such as it was, he felt it was the perfect time to bail, hopping out the window. "I don't care what influence Xavier has with the school board, I am going to get." She entered the room, Scott, Naruto, and Jean in her wake. "What?" She gasped in outraged disbelief. "What happened here? Who took my furniture?" She went dashing out, the trio forgotten. Hearing the unwanted sound of a chuckling Toad, they went to the open window and bore witness to the amphibious mutant zapping away the principal's prized new convertible into the ether. Scott turned to Jean, Naruto catching some of the glance. "Bet I know what happened to Kurt." Kurt slunk into the gym before porting upward, surprised by a shadow, an actual shadow, coming from behind him. Clinging to the wall just over the door, he looked down to see a teen coughing in his smoke. "Whoa. Where'd you come from?" Kurt flipped down, landing back on the wood floor and, as it were, it was now his turn to surprise the newcomer. "Relax. What are you, man?" the other teen asked, deciding whether or not to freak all the way out. Kurt waved his arms up in surrender. "Don't let my looks fool you. I'm just a harmless blue fuzzball, really," he urged. Getting a better look at the other teen, recognition dawned on him. "Hey, I know you. You're the one I saw on the computer screen just before it blew." The teen shrugged, seeming to calm now that they were in the territory of easily answered questions. "Yeah. The name's Forge. You found my lab, huh? What's with the Halloween getup?" he asked, scrutinizing. Kurt, Nightcrawler, held his arms out. "No costume. I'm human. But I'm a mutant. I know I look strange," but he ported, reappearing right behind Forge. "There are some fringe benefits." Forge whirled around. "Trippy. I thought I was the only one." Raising his arm, it mutated into a metal appendage with small robotic arms of its own. "School out already." They had left a good 10 or so minutes early to chase after Toad. "There he goes." Scott in the lead, Naruto was at his side, finding it far easier to match pace than Evan, Kitty, and Jean. Each was in their institute uniform, even Naruto, for the second time outside of training. Each was tailored for the owner's specific skills and abilities. For example, Evans was reinforced in certain areas to handle his bony expulsions. There weren't many others that needed such considerations. Aurora, Storm, needed such to help with her ability to glide. Wolverine's uniform was designed to take a beating, plain and simple, so the material was durable and the seams were reinforced. This was like Wolverine's uniform. Similar boots, though pale yellow like the others. Deep blue, near black uniform. Pants and a tight shirt with sleeves that went down to just at his biceps. On his legs and obliques, a series of muted crimson slashes climbed. At his waist, a yellow belt, the X symbol located at his left hip. Hidden, unless someone knew to look, were a pair of black pouches, one on either leg. His addition had been a face mask. A red cloth face mask that ended just below his eyes descended down and into his collar. He may not have liked Kakashi all that much towards the end, but he couldn't deny his sense of style. He'd thought about gloves, like the others, but decided against. There was no telling how long they'd last what with his excessive Rasengan usage. Realistically, it wasn't all that big of a surprise when they finally caught him. In the so-dubbed Middleverse, Forge explained how he ended up there. From the creation of the pocket dimension to his overextended stay. He was ready to leave. Through the whole talk, utilizing bits and pieces of things that had recently been sent into the dimension, he constructed his plan for their escape. The Lansky was pinned to a tree and the device was safely in Kitty's arms. Scott knelt next to him, hand on his visor. "Now, tell us what you did to Kurt." "I didn't do anything." Toad sputtered in protest. "He didn't." Eyes reoriented to Rogue standing just off the clearing by a bench. "I did." Putting her hands on her hips, "If you all ever want to find Blue Boy, you better let him go." She brought them to the lab, such as it was. This is where it happened. Scott knelt to pick up the broken image inducer before rounding on Rogue. If you've hurt him, I'm gonna. You start threatening me and you're never gonna find your friend. She's lying. Eyes focused on Naruto. Blue eyes fixed on the Gov. Girl. She doesn't know that for sure. Get out of my mind. She spat. Naruto scoffed. I'm not a psychic, he countered. But I can hear your pulse from here and I've been watching your facial expressions. She looked downright furious. This was an accident, I can see that much and you feel guilty about it. Her fists balled. Yo, guys. Kitty broke in. She and Evan had been looking over the device. We've been running a diagnostic on this thing. Can you believe it? It uses CPM. Evan announced, hardly able to believe it. I mean, talk about retro, man. It's putting out some kind of, like, steady low power pulse wave that just seems to disappear into thin air. And that means what exactly? Scott asked. This was far and away from flying the Blackbird or programming a DVD player. Evan answered this time. We figure that the pulse has trapped the crawler in some other dimension. Unseen and unnoticed, Forge and Nightcrawler both cheered. Scott stepped forward, hand on his visor. Okay, so let's trash this thing. Forge's eyes went wide and he made rapid arm movements, which were, again, unseen by the others. No. They've got it all wrong. He ran over to Kurt, grabbing him by the shoulders. If they destroy the projector, we'll be trapped here forever. Kurt's face reflected absolute horror. Scott placed the device on a surviving but thoroughly trashed work table before backing away. Okay, everyone stand back. I'm gonna use full power. This could get messy. You know, I could just, phase through the gizmo and, quietly short it out, Kitty proposed just as he was about to fire. Scott and Evan both just sent her blank stares. Right. Forget I mentioned it. Giving in, she leaned over to Jean. What is it with guys and explosions anyway? Jean stifled a small laugh. Kitty looked to Naruto, seeing as he hadn't said anything about blowing the thingus up. Don't ask me my opinion, Kitty, answering the unspoken question. You're looking at someone whose more memorable fights, on average, wrecked square miles. Kitty's eyes bugged out. Naruto laughed weakly. I'll tell you guys sometime. In a flurried rush, they attached the device, bits and pieces strapped all over the fuzzy blue mutant. With only a pair of double A's these batteries don't have much power. You're only gonna have enough juice for a second, he explained quickly. I was rushed in. Just tell me what to do. Okay. Press that button, then teleport. Remember, you'll only have a second. Tell them not to destroy the machine, but to reset it. Right. I'm gone. He pressed the button. Bamf. Ready at last to wreck the machine, Scott's hand was on his visor when the air in front of them, on the opposite side of said device, started to crackle statically. Surrounded by an aura of yellowish flaring energy, Kurt appeared before them, face contorted with uncharacteristic worry. He didn't waste a second. He only had the one. Reset. Don't des and he was gone, as quickly as he'd come. Scott froze. You guys saw that, right? He's still alive. Rogue breathed, though the relieved comment was more for her than the others as they themselves had borne witness, too. What was he saying? Jean questioned, paying mind to what had to be important. Kitty shrugged, too shocked at the sight to remember what the fuzzy blue teen had said. He said, reset don't. Don't reset it, Evan rationalized. He wants you to blow it up. Do it. Kitty huffed, crossing her arms. I swear these guys are, obsessed. Scott cupped his chin, pondering his own view of the momentary missive. It sounded more like a warning to me. Do you think they'll get it? Kurt crossed his fingers. I just hope they believe it. Evan snorted, not believing it for a moment. A warning. From the goofman himself. No. Come on, shred that sucker. Ah. Forge looked appraisingly at Nightcrawler. Man, you do have a rep. Scott shook his head. No. Nightcrawler's a joker, but even he knows when it's time to get serious. Yes. Look, if he wanted to blow up the projector, why didn't he say, don't reset? Instead of reset then don't. His English is better than that, Naruto added supportively. Oh, sick. You the man. Kurt cheered, delivering a double thumbs up. I think he wants us to reset this thing. Score. Forge and Kurt chorused, high-fiving one another. Picking it back up, Scott turned the device over, looking over the buttons. Fortunately, they were labeled. All intensity settings, power regulation, beam width restart. He jabbed the button. Button glowing, the device started to hum. Dropping it back on the table, Scott backed away quickly, just in case. A yellow beam cut the air, the energy discharge causing a slight wind in the room. Inside the field of energy, two figures came into focus. One was unknown, but the other was Kurt. Come on. Scott shouted to them. Teleport through. Kurt grinned. Hang on. Let's go. We can't, Forge quickly negated. The batteries tapped out, pointing to the drained cells. We need more juice to get us home. Kurt noticed something though. Look. The portal was closing. The portal won't last much longer. It's now or never. What's the matter? Scott called to them. Let's go. Kurt tried to think of something. Anything. Another power source. Then an idea hit him. I know. Come on. Grabbing Forge, the pair teleported away into the Middleverse. What are they doing? Evan cried out, seeing them disappear and not reappear. Scott shook his head, his jaw tight. I don't know. But I hope they hustle. There they are. Heads turned as Mystique's Chosen entered the basement. And they still got that vape ray I was telling you about, Toad added. On either side were Avers and Dukes, or, given their uniforms, Avalanche and Blob, respectively. Avalanche sent a look at Rogue. Rogue, Mystique sent us to find you. So you with us or them? Mystique? Scott asked, not believing, turning to Rogue amidst them. You working for her? Not liking his tone, she rounded on him in turn. Hey, Summers, you got your friends, I got mine, poking him in the chest before walking away from them. Towards Mystique's minions and past. But this ain't my fight. I'm out of here. Once out the door, hostilities continued. Okay. Fork it over, losers, Blob sneered, holding out his am-sized meat hook, Lance delivering the other end of the ultimatum. Or this place is gonna rock, and stomped down on the concrete. The cement beneath them shuddered, trembling momentarily as a warning. The projector stays with us, Scott declared, the others gathering around him. X-Men, keep that portal open. Your call. Slamming his boot into the floor, face straining, Avalanche sent a tremor through the ground at them, his mutant partners following in its wake. Amph. Kurt and Forge appeared in the school hallways. Groovy ride. The retro teen crowed. But where's this power source? Kurt turned and pointed to the wrecked convertible in the middle of the hall. Check it. Forge grinned. Arm changing, he raced over to the vehicle. Far out, man. Left standing alone while the other worked, Kurt shook his head in frustration. I swear, that homie's lingo is so whack. It was, unofficially, Cyclops and Jean versus Blob, Spike versus Toad, and that left Kitty and Naruto to fend off Avalanche. In truth, Naruto could have taken them all, easily. There was just the issue of collateral damage. Come on. Hit me with your best shot, Slim. Blob begged, and got an optic beam to the gut for it. Not that it did all that much. It only made him stumble backward a bit. Rising from one knee, he smirked. Takes more than that to stop the Blob. Thanks for the tip. Jean. Scott signaled. He blasted as much of a circle around the teen as he could. Taking it from there, she telekinetically ripped the hunk from beneath Blob, leaving him to fall backward, crashing, into the hole. You and me got a date, pretty kitty, Avalanche ranted, advancing on her. How about a ride on the concrete coaster? And sent a shockwave powerful enough to make the floor take on wave-like undulations heading for her. Whoa. She cried out, before being thrown against the wall. Phasing, she passed right through it. A second later, she shot back out, rolling to her feet. Lousy ride, loser. She snapped. You've got to learn how to treat a lady, Naruto lectured, kicking his feet out from under him. Jumping back to his feet in a blur, he grabbed the airborne teen by the chest of his uniform and slammed him into the ground. Avalanche groaned at his aching back. In truth, Naruto had gone exceptionally easy on him. Toad bounced beepily around Spike. Come on. Come on. What you got? He teased. You ain't got nothing. That's right. You ain't got nothing. Evan lunged for him but missed, Toad going for the projector. Spikes jutting from his arm, he lashed out and let them fly. Oof. A series of long spikes bringing Toad to a halt as he slammed face first into them. You called it nothing, you slimy superball. Spike ragged in return. The engine struggled, but at least it was running. Kurt was behind the wheel, Forge at his side just finishing splicing a few wires. You're sure this will work? No, Forge admitted. Kurt groaned, but it wasn't like they had any better options. Wonderbar. Let's hit it. He gunned the car down the hall, and 50 feet into its trip, it disappeared in a cloud of sulfurous smoke. Toad, Avalanche, and Blob had regrouped, though Avalanche looked a little worse for wear. Okay, enough of the warm-ups, Blob snarked. Time for some serious smashing. Honk. Honk. Heads shot around to the now minuscule ball of light that was the diminished portal. Look out. Scott warned, and they all, the X-Men that is, dived away from it to the sides. None too soon either as a ruined seafoam green convertible burst through. Yahoo. Kurt and Forge roared over the engine and screeching brakes. Toad and Avalanche hurled themselves behind Blob, the Heavisite teen bracing himself. The front of the car crumpled upon meeting his ham hands, but both occupants were protected by massive inflated cushions. Whoa. Good thing I'm the Blob, Dukes admitted, relieved, getting hearty agreements from those hiding behind him. Yeah, you can say that again. Unfortunately, said car happened to crash land right on the projector. It smoked and fizzled before going completely inert, the smoking continuing. Avalanche groaned. Come on, guys. This party's over. All this for nothing. And his back ached like nothing else. Trying not to look like they'd lost anything, the disappointed trio marched out, all the fun gone from the fight. What the heck are these? Forge questioned, experimentally pressing on the inflated cushion that had saved his face from flattening against the dashboard. Re-entry cushions. Cool, eh? Supplied a grinning Kurt, pounding on one for effect. Uniforms doffed and back in their civilian attire, they exited the now positively wrecked basement. From afar, Rogue watched them leave. She was relieved. You're welcome to crash with us for a while, Forge, Scott offered. Xavier's cool. You'd like him. They all gathered between Scott's and Naruto's cars. Forge looked interested, but shook his head. Thanks, but I better go find my parents, he excused. I'm 20 years late for curfew. He turned to Kurt. Thanks for bailing me out. Hey, anytime, slapping palms. Need a lift? Naruto offered, opening the driver's side door of his car. Evan apparently wanted to be his wingman, dashing around to get into the passenger's seat. Shotgun. Forge chuckled. No problem. It's just a few blocks, he explained, motioning over his shoulder, and started walking off. Okay, Scott gave in, but pulled a pad of paper from his pocket and took a second to write a string of numbers down. But if you need any help, just call. Forge gone, everyone was distributed between the two vehicles. As was most often, Jean rode with Scott and Kurt and Kitty were in the back. Adjusting his mirror, Scott stopped on Kurt's reflection. You're gonna have to duck until we can get you a new Hola watch. Kurt gasped in feigned shock. So it's true. You're ashamed of me. Right, dude. Scott actually chuckled before turning apologetic. Hey, listen. About what happened before. My bad. Jean and Kitty stared. Kurt shook his head wearily. No. It was on me too. Maybe you're right, he admitted. I take things too seriously. I need to lighten up some. Despite his inner nature, Naruto kept his mouth shut. Oh, Scott, not you, Jean ribbed. Kitty snickered. Check his temperature. Mr. Military's going soft. Reaching up to feel his forehead. He waved her off. And I could probably dial down the goofing a little, Kurt sighed. Ah, welcome back. Twisting in the driver's seat, he and Kurt knocked knuckles. Really, everything was going to be alright. Hands back on the wheel, okay. So now what do you say we head home, gear up and run a level 3 training sim in the danger room? He offered. Everyone groaned and started grumbling. Give us a break. Jean. Oh, man. Kurt moaned in exasperation. See? Motioning at Scott. That's what I'm talking about. Always serious. Psyche. Naruto shook his head, groaning at the weak joke. Although it was a step up for Scott. Most everyone else shared a laugh at the unexpected jocularity. Kitty giggled. You got us. Kurt gave Scott a mock congratulatory pat on the shoulder. Very nice. There's hope for you yet. Yeah, well, tell me about it on the way to Duncan Matthews' party, Scott offered. Kitty pouted. Oh, I can't go, remember? I'm, like, a freshman. Scott lay a comforting arm around her shoulders. Hey. You're also one of the X-Men. Jean nodded in agreement. Don't worry. We'll make it happen. So, no training? Naruto asked innocently. Well, mostly innocent. Shut up. Kitty hissed at him. Let's roll. The Soul Blue X-Man declared. Two engines roared to life and, one after the other, the cars rolled out of the starlit parking lot. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video guys, let me know in the comments section how was the story and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video, bye bye.